I think it's got two main factors. The first is that if deafness is the silent disability, then tinnitus is the non-silent one to some degree, but it's still in the realm of something that you can't actually see. You can't see someone with tinnitus and notice that they have tinnitus. It's also not considered, bluntly, to be life-threatening, even though many people find it very distressing and it impacts on their social life, on their ability to sleep. So that's one reason. It's downplayed, and that is consistent with the general view of hearing disabilities. The second reason, I believe, is that there hasn't been a concerted effort to look at tinnitus from the research community that's actually been able to be sustained for a significant period of time. So people do tinnitus research on the side sometimes, and it's quite difficult to get research money from the major funders, for example, to carry out tinnitus research. It's important to remember that the magnetic stimulation is actually affecting only the symptoms of tinnitus. So it's a cortical stimulation, and this is the, if you like, the end point, or close to the end point at which tinnitus could be generated. So it's a symptoms oriented therapy. That isn't to say that it's not a good therapy in the absence of any therapies that would look at the causes or be directed towards the causes. My view is that the jury is still out on TMS, and I think until there's a detailed study of its effects on a large cohort of patients, and there are very few large cohorts studies being done so far, until there's a detailed study as to what it's actually doing, not just for tinnitus but in general, it's actually still unclear what the actual neurophysiological basis for TMS is, then I think we won't know too much. But certainly if it's helping people in the short term, it's worth pursuing. Well, the inferior colliculus is the major auditory region in the midbrain, and I don't so much think it's the site for the generation of tinnitus, but it is the place at which all of the ascending pathways, all the pathways of nerve fibers that arrive from your ear and go to various parts of your brain, they all converge on the inferior colliculus. In addition, you get a lot of what's called descending input from the higher levels of the brain, including non-auditory parts, so parts that are involved in emotion, for example. They also descend onto the inferior colliculus. And it's a cocktail of neurons, it's a cocktail of various neurotransmitters, it's a cocktail of various what are called neuromodulators. These are things that change not just auditory perception, but they may be mood changes. Serotonin, for example. There are lots of serotonergic, as they're called, receptors. These are neurons that have, the neurons actually have little sites where serotonin can act. And this is not a specific auditory effect. And if there's a lot of descending influence on the inferior colliculus, as well as a lot of ascending influence, so information coming up and down, then it's a good site to look at tinnitus and say, well, maybe here is a point at which we can start to target our therapies, because this is where all the information has to go at some point through this inferior colliculus. It may be the first port of call where we can pin down a general therapy for tinnitus. Well, I'm fortunate in the sense that when I developed tinnitus, I was already in the hearing research field. I developed tinnitus after a very noisy party in an Irish pub in Sheffield about 10 years ago. Yeah. And at the time, I was actually developing with some colleagues a system for measuring hearing thresholds for medical students to test their hearing. And I was having trouble with some of the tones that I was listening to. And it was then that I found out I had tinnitus that was essentially interfering with my ability to hear these sounds properly. I was able to get my hearing tested by a colleague, and I've always paid attention to the literature on tinnitus ever since. It really wasn't a field of study before that. So I'm fortunate in that perspective. A lot of people, of course, aren't. And really, one of the important factors about tinnitus and coping with tinnitus, I believe, is being informed. The more information you have, the more you realize that it's actually, first, shared by quite a lot of other people, and second, it generally isn't a serious medical problem that's underlying it. It may have serious effects on your lifestyle, and it may have serious effects on your ability to cope from day to day. Those are very bad effects, clearly, but they're not generally going to cause you to die. And I think that's a liberating thing to know. What is causing tinnitus, we don't know as scientists yet, but we definitely know that it's actually not going to be very destructive to you in your brain, for example. I believe one reason why tinnitus research is relatively poorly funded is that people still don't quite know where to put it. They don't know which box it goes in. So for funding purposes, is it a neuroscience problem? Is it a mental health problem? Is it a biochemical problem? People still are unsure of where to put it in their scheme of things. It's also the case that you can't understand tinnitus, since it's your brain that's actually generating the sound that you perceive. You can't understand tinnitus unless you understand the auditory brain as well. And just in the way that we understand the auditory brain with a whole group of specialists in different fields connecting up, that's it. So we'll only understand tinnitus. We have to understand from the ear to the cortex, and in fact all the way back. There's an awful lot of information flow from the ear to your central nervous system, but there's an awful lot of what's called gain control, an awful lot of control top-down from your cortex, manipulating, if you like, the energy or the signals that are actually coming up the wire. So there's an awful lot of basic science to know before you could even start to understand tinnitus. And I think the only way we'll understand tinnitus from a scientific perspective is by putting it in the framework of understanding normal hearing as well. I think the first thing people would have to do who develop tinnitus is first get themselves checked out medically. You never know what the underlying cause is, but most likely getting a referral to a specialist centre is going to alleviate a lot of the concern. So getting a referral to a centre that contains people who not only can measure your hearing but also can provide support in terms of the various therapies that are available and are often very useful for people is what you need. You should really be expecting your GP to be able to refer you. Other things that are worth doing, of course, is contacting help and support groups who have a lot of information, can connect you up with a lot of other sufferers and also a lot of other centres where people are actively engaged in looking for cures or actively engaged in generating interest in tinnitus and its causes.